Slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
You know, Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.
Okay, we are back, family.
Back again. And I'm just real quick, I'm just going to intro something just real quick, and then I'm going to let Miss Kim take over. I just want to mention that if you haven't seen the Midterm Madness, go check it out right here on Email the Mass Media Group. And then we're actually going to have a follow-up for this Sunday, which will be 10:30, probably around the same time, 11 a.m., I think. But we'll definitely let you know. So stay tuned right here on Emin, the Mass Media Group. And that's all that I have to say right now. So I'll let you take it over.
Yeah, stay tuned for part 2, Midterm Madness, and certainly go by and check out part 1. And, make sure to study up on those propositions and the representatives that we're going to be voting for on November 8th. For sure. So you can all vote in our best interest. All right. So we are continuing with Chapter 10, Stolen Labor and Hindered Opportunity of the California Reparations Interim Report. And we're on about page 337 if you're looking at the electronic version of the report. I'll just read this little insert. We're talking about fair labor. Little insert on page 337 of that report before we get started that says, like other New Deal laws, the Fair Labor Standards Act excluded agriculture and domestic services from its labor protections. Because of these exclusions, the FLSA essentially outlawed white child labor and continued to allow black child labor because most white children worked in industrial settings and most black children worked in agriculture. All right. So, Fair Labor Standards Acts of 1938. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, FLSA, which is still in force today, provides the federal minimum wage. The maximum number of working hours before overtime pay is required, and the limits on child labor. Like other New Deal laws, in order to appease Southern Democrats, the law purposefully excluded certain occupational categories like agriculture and domestic services, preventing the majority of African Americans from benefiting from the law's protections. Because of these exclusions, the FLSA essentially outlawed child labor in industrial settings, where most white children worked at the time, and allowed child labor in agriculture and domestic work, where most Black children worked. Members of Congress were clear about the racist intent. For example, Florida Representative J. Mark Wilcox explicitly stated, "You cannot put the Negro and the white man on the same basis and get away with it." Not only would such a situation result in grave social and racial conflicts, but it would also result in throwing the Negro out of employment and in making him a public charge. There's just is not any sense in intensifying the racial problems in the South, and this bill cannot help but produce such a result. Congressman Cox of Georgia specifically objected to the possibility of equal wages because of the impact it would have on relieving the economic subjugation of African Americans, central to the social organization of the South, stating, the FLSA will end destroying state sovereignty and local self-determination, render easier the elimination and disappearance of racial and social distinctions. As with the New Deal legislation, Congress included the agricultural and domestic service exemptions in order to secure the support from the Southern Democrats needed to pass the legislation at all. Right? Thus, when the FLSA passed without applying the agricultural or domestic workers or to employers engaged in intrastate commerce, such as service workers, it achieved the explicit aims of drafting Congress. Like the other New Deal legislation, it accomplished the withholding of protections from many African Americans through these race-neutral occupational exclusions. These carve-outs remained until 1970s. The agricultural workers are still excluded from overtime protections. As originally enacted, the FLSA did not address pay for tipped workers. While tipping prior to the Civil War had been frowned upon by many as an aristocratic European practice, incompatible with American democracy, after the war, many restaurants and rail operators embraced tipping as a means of hiring newly freed African Americans without actually paying them. These workers were forced to labor for tips alone. Tipping thus kept Black workers in an economically and socially subordinate position. Later, the Supreme Court held that employers could count workers' tip towards their wages when calculating whether the worker was receiving minimum wage. Employers did not need to pay their employers at all as long as workers' income from tips met or exceeded the established federal minimum wage. Congress did not require a base wage for tipped employees until 1966, set then as 50% of the federal minimum wage. You know, I just came over from Chris Lodgton reading on Twitter. He's on the same chapter, just finished the first part of chapter 10 himself. And he was saying that he was in that same situation out there in New York, just working for tips only tips. That's it. All right, that's interjection. So to continue, the tip federal hourly minimum wage stands today at $2.13, where it has been for more than a quarter of a century. Wow. The employer must make up the difference between this amount and the federal minimum hourly wage of $7.25 only if the employee's tips combined with the direct wages of at least $2.13 per hour do not equal the federal minimum hourly wage. Today's tipped wage system carries a legacy of slavery. While Black workers no longer are overrepresented in the tipped workforce, studies of the restaurant industry have revealed that diners consistently tip Black servers less than white servers, regardless of service, and 17% of tipped working people of color live in poverty, compared to less than 13% of all tipped workers. Federal Emergency Relief Administration, 1933 to 1935, and Works Progress Administration, 1935 to 1941. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, provided funding for state and local government programs in public works and the arts and provided more than 20 million jobs. But the program disproportionately spent its funds on unemployed white workers, frequently refusing to hire Black workers for anything except unskilled labor and paying less than the officially stipulated wage. One local administrator stated that he had to tailor relief to accommodate the demands of Southern plantation owners for cheap farm labor by curtailing the level of relief payments to agricultural laborers and sharecroppers. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, replaced FERA in 1935, but continued its racist and often sexist practices. For example, driven by the presumption that men were the primary earners and most in need of jobs among needy families, most projects created heavy construction type work for men, ignoring women's wage needs and limiting their opportunities. From 1935 to 1941, fewer than 20% of all WPA workers were women, and only about 3% were Black women. Projects to train women in domestic skill were often explicitly limited to only white women. Government officials specifically pushed Black workers out of WPA jobs when local conditions required cheap agricultural labor. In Oklahoma, a WPA official closed a Black women's work project when there was a large cotton crop. Writing to Washington, D.C., these women are perfectly able to do this kind of work, and there is plenty of work to do. Civilian Conservation Corps, 1933 to 1942. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, a public works program focused on conservation projects, employed over 2.5 million men during its tenure. Black and white women were completely excluded, just 10% of whom were Black men. While this was somewhat similar to the percentage of African Americans in the population at large, the conditions of the CCC replicated the racist government interventions seen in other programs, which explicitly limited participation numbers, official segregation at work camps, and with Black workers restricted to the least desirable unskilled jobs. For example, in Georgia, local selection agents refused to enroll a single Black applicant for almost a year, and only relented and enrolled a token number of African Americans after federal agents threatened to withhold the state's entire allotment of funds. Tennessee Valley Authority. The Tennessee Valley Authority was a public utility created by the federal government to bring jobs and development to an area hit especially hard in the Depression. The project included construction, conservation, and social service jobs, and it remains one of the largest utilities in the country today. It too continued the pattern of the other government works program. Black workers were assigned to work separately on construction projects and were only allowed to work at all if there were enough Black workers to make up a full segregated crew. Black workers were also denied foreman or supervisory roles. Agricultural Adjustment Administration. The federal government created the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, AAA, in 1933 to increase agricultural prices by paying farmers to grow fewer crops. The administration of the AAA harmed Black workers in three specific ways. First, the program reduced crop planting. For example, the agency limited the amount of land dedicated to cotton farming, but allowed each white landowner to decide which acres to stop cultivating, and most often they chose those worked by Black tenant farmers and sharecroppers. Second, landowners received federal payments, but the federal administration allowed white landowners to act as trustees for their Black tenants without oversight from the AAA. Often, landowners never paid their Black tenants. Third, the AAA allowed disputes over payments to be brought to local elected county committees and not a single Black farmer served on the county committee throughout the South. The county committees, composed of white landlords and white tenants, ruled against Black tenants and directed the vast majority of benefits for the program to white farm owners. In 1934, Ira D. A. Reed of the National Urban League said that so far as the Negroes in the South are concerned, the AAA and other New Deal agencies might as well be administered by the Ku Klux Klan. Fair Employment Practices Committee. Faced with enormous activist pressure, President Roosevelt during World War II attempted to protect Black workers, but these actions were temporary and did not have serious enforcement powers. In the lead up to World War II, civil rights activists demanded desegregation of the defense industry. Following a 1941 meeting of civil rights groups from across the country, activists formed the March on Washington movement with the aim of using mass protests to desegregate the military and industrial workplaces that were central to the war effort. Soon, the movement had spread across the country with local chapters from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. By June 1941, 100,000 or more Black workers from across the country were expected to march on the nation's capital, alarming President Roosevelt at the prospect of a mass protest in Washington, D.C. on the eve of the country's entry into war. In response, he issued Executive Order 8802, which both banned discrimination on the basis of race in government, employment, defense industries, and training programs, and created the Fair Employment Practices Committee, FEPC, to investigate and address complaints of race discrimination. While a step forward, FEPC had power over only public finance wartime industry, and it did not have any real enforcement power. It was only able to issue recommendations, including the cancellation of defense contracts in case of persistent discrimination. FEPC's impact varied around the country. From March 1942 to 1944, Black employment and war production jobs rose from under 3% to over 8%. and some Black workers found jobs as skilled labor in manufacturing and minor managerial roles. The most progress was made in places where Black activists, progressive unions, and local civil rights organizations worked together with FEPC investigations to pressure for change. In St. Louis, a large march on Washington movement chapter agitated to reinstate Black workers at local arms plant, raise wages, and increase hiring of Black women. The organization used its resources to file and pursue FEPC complaints, justifying establishment of a regional office to address the concerns of Black works, but pursued this official action hand in hand with mass rallies to general grassroots support. Under the weak enforcement system, other geographic areas were less successful. Both public officials and private employers in several southern cities refused to provide integrated defense employment, and the federal government did not force action. FEPC had no mechanism to act against Alabama Governor Frank Dixon, who supported employment of Black war workers only within the bounds of the segregationist system already in place in southern states. FEPC disbanded in 1946 as the war ended, thus ending a temporary attempt of limited effectiveness to address labor discrimination. Gains and limitations of the Civil Rights Act. Congress passed a series of civil rights laws in the 1960s prohibiting discrimination in employment, voting, and housing. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Title VII created strong protection for Black workers throughout the country, making it illegal for an employer to, 1, fail to hire or discriminate against a worker, or 2, limit job opportunities because of the worker's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The law protects workers against current racial discrimination and segregation practices, but does not provide a way to right past wrongs. It exempts bona fide seniority systems and professionally developed ability tests. The former are also known as last hired, first fired systems, and the latter include tests developed as part of an application process, such as for firefighters, even though these can be employed in a discriminatory manner. Strict adherence to a seniority system means that last hired Black workers who more recently moved into positions now that racist discrimination is outlawed will be the first fired. Under the systems allowed by the law, in 1977, the Supreme Court held that Title VII did not outlaw these seniority systems, even when they discriminate against Black workers, stating that a seniority policy does not become unlawful under Title VII simply because it may perpetrate pre-act discrimination. Title VII is limited in other ways as well. The Supreme Court also drew a line between intentional and unintentional discrimination. Currently, Title VII protects an employee if they can show that their employer intended to discriminate against them, which can be difficult to prove. If the employee cannot prove their employer's racist intentions, Title VII protects them only if the challenged employment practice is not job-related or not consistent with business necessity. For example, in Griggs versus Duke Power Company, the defendant company required a high school diploma, or passing an intelligence test for certain jobs. Neither requirement was related to successful job performance, and both requirements disqualified Black applicants at a substantially higher rate than white applicants. The requirements did not fulfill a genuine business need and was thus prohibited by the Act. In 1965, Congress formed a federal agency called the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission to enforce Title VII and other employment statutes and regulations. The commission, which continues today, covers all industries and not just wartime industries. Like its predecessor, the Fair Employment Practices Committee, it also has enforcement powers to assess penalties and issue orders instead of only making recommendations. However, the agency has been chronically underfunded, which has limited its ability to widely enforce federal protections against racial discrimination in large number of cases. The agency's staff numbers decreased from 3,390 to 1,968 between 1980 and 2018, despite the U.S. population increasing by more than 44% at the time. Limits of affirmative action. As the civil rights were only forward-looking between 1964 and the late 1970s, the federal government enacted affirmative action programs intended to address the effects of past racial discrimination and segregation. These programs increased the number of underrepresented groups in government contracting work until the Supreme Court and the Reagan administration in the 1980s effectively brought many federal affirmative action programs to an end. In 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson issued Executive Order 11246, which required government contractors to employ affirmative action to expand opportunities for underrepresented groups and establish the Office of Federal Contract Compliance to enforce the order. In 1972, the Nixon administration approved the Philadelphia Plan, which instituted numerical goals and timetables for the integration of Black and other racial minority workers in federal contracts. In the late 1970s, President Jimmy Carter extended affirmative action requirements to state and local governments, educational institutions, and contractors, nearly every entity that did business with the federal government. These executive actions, along with anti-discrimination laws, improved labor market conditions for African Americans. Between 1974 and 1980, the rate of minority employment in business that contracted with the federal government rose by 20%. Local government set-aside programs also had impact. A 2014 study found that these programs led to a 35 to 40% reduction in the Black-white wealth gap, or in the Black-white gap, not wealth gap. Just gap in self-employment, which in proxy for small business ownership, though it appeared that the gains mostly benefited those who were better educated. By the late 1970s, an organized backlash had developed and a number of lawsuits challenged the constitutionality of affirmative action. In response, the U.S. Supreme Court began narrowing the scope of affirmative action programs. The court has not held that affirmative action is permissible as redress for past harms. The court, however, did reject explicit race-based quota systems in Regents of the University of California versus Bake in 1978. There, the court held that it was permissible for government affirmative action programs in this case, a state school, to consider an applicant's race in order to advance the interests of diversity, but that it was unconstitutional for an affirmative action program to employ race-based quotas. By early 1980, under President Ronald Reagan, the federal government began to restrict its enforcement of affirmative action requirements, halting the progress made during the preceding administrations. Housing segregation limits Black job opportunities. Despite the unquestionable progress made in civil rights workers' rights since the Civil Rights Act, numerous systematic issues continue to harm Black workers. Let's see. The government and private actions described in Chapter 5 created a segregated American landscape across the country. This residential segregation created an entrenched type of employment discrimination in the second half of the 20th century. Following World War II, white workers followed the government incentives described in Chapter 5, housing segregation, and moved to the suburbs. Large industrial employers closed facilities in urban centers and followed the white workers. Black workers who could not move to the suburbs due to the barriers erected by federal and local governments were left behind in urban centers. These barriers included discriminatory and inequitable government transportation policies, decisions, and limited urban African American access to jobs, like the Bay Area Rapid Transit BART system, designed in the 1960s. In an Oakland neighborhood that is one of the most diverse in the city and one of the densest parts of the region. BART trains run nearly 3 miles without stopping, whereas BART stations are only 1.75 miles apart in suburban areas that are less than half as dense. As one transportation expert explained, BART was literally designed to speed white suburban commuters past Black inner city residents. For an in-depth discussion on the transportation discrimination, please see Chapter 7. Research has produced evidence that the phenomenon of job suburbanization caused significant decline in Black employment and increased Black-white labor inequality. Examples of the movement of jobs to suburbs abound. For instance, the Ford Motor Company moved all engine production sites at its River Rogue plant, at the time the largest employer of Black workers in the Detroit region, to facilities in suburban Brook Parks near Cleveland and Dearborn, outside of Detroit. Michigan's labor market letter observed the creation of a very large and alarmingly consistent list of long-term unemployed Black workers in the region. The exodus of major employers to the suburbs also prevented African Americans from fully taking advantage of benefits provided by unions. For example, the Communication Worker of America lost thousands of Black members when customer service call centers moved out of New York City and reopened in areas not easily accessible to African Americans living in the city. Between 1967 and 1987, the number of industrial jobs dropped precipitously in cities with large Black populations, by 64% in Philadelphia, by 60% in Chicago, by 58% in New York, and by 51% in Detroit. Oakland and Los Angeles also experienced a decline in manufacturing. Automobile and tire companies that had been prevalent in Los Angeles shuttered or moved to the suburbs as early as the 1950s. An analysis of census data for the 15 largest metropolitan areas of the time found that between 1960 and 1970, the suburbs of these areas saw a 44% increase in jobs, while central cities saw a 7% decline, whereas nearly 2/3 of the jobs were in urban centers in 1960. By 1970, only 52% of the jobs were in urban centers. And in some cities, the majority of the jobs were suburban. Corporate executives occasionally admitted that avoiding Black communities sometimes motivated their decisions about where to locate. Federal jobs in urban center also dropped by more than 41,000 between 1966 and 1973. By the early 1900s, the Black urban industrial working class had nearly disappeared nationwide. The impact was broad. Between 1970 and 1993, African Americans lost ground in nearly every economic category, with unemployment among African Americans rising from 5.6% to 12.9%. If new manufacturing was built, for example, by American auto companies, studies have shown a consistent pattern of rural and suburban locations about 30 miles from the Black neighborhoods. More recently, U.S. trade policy added to the negative impact of automation and changing technology on jobs for African Americans. Free trade policies and the resulting job losses in the manufacturing sector hit Black men especially hard, as this sector had offered relatively higher paying jobs for those with lower levels of educational attainment. These jobs were also more likely to be unionized and afford a range of attendant benefits, from health care to pensions. Black workers were also disproportionately among those whose call center and customer service jobs were subject to offshoring. One study found that African Americans lost 646,500 good manufacturing jobs between 1998 and 2020, a 3.4% decline in total Black manufacturing employment as part of the overall loss of more than 5 million manufacturing jobs during that time period. Black workers who have lost their jobs have been less likely than their white counterparts to find a replacement job, and when they found new jobs, they more than likely experienced pay cuts. The loss of jobs to free trade also depressed wages in the long term and intensified wealth inequality. The impact has been far-reaching. One researcher found that manufacturing decline between 1960 and 2010 had disproportionately harmed Black communities in the areas of wages, employment, marriage rates, house values, poverty rates, death rates, single parenthood, teen motherhood, child poverty, and child mortality. These harms may continue. More than a quarter of all Black workers are concentrated in 30 jobs at high risk of automation, according to the 2019 finding of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. Ongoing discrimination, legal segregation resulted in social separation between Black and white Americans, with lasting consequences. Employers often hire new employees by relying on their social networks, ethnic loyalties, apprenticeships, and union relationships. Legal segregation prevented Black workers from building these necessary formal and informal networks with white Americans, effectively barring Black Americans from entering into new, mostly white workplaces or industries. African Americans continue to experience labor discrimination today. One meta-analysis examining a 25-year period starting in 1989 found that discrimination against African Americans in the labor force had not decreased. African Americans receive interview callbacks for jobs at lower rates than white people. In a study where equally qualified resumes with white-sounding and black-sounding names were sent out, white applicants received 36% more callbacks than Black applicants. Even when researchers enhanced the resumes associated with Black-sounding names to make them stronger, white candidates still received more callbacks. Another study found that Black candidates had stronger odds of being called for an interview when their resumes were stripped of information conveying racial or ethnic background. Discrimination against job applicants with criminal history is another factor limiting the opportunities for African Americans. As discussed above in the licensure section, this discrimination is mandated in some instances and permitted in others. As mass incarceration and has disproportionately impacted African Americans, they have disproportionately suffered post-incarceration challenges. By 2010, people with felony convictions accounted for 8% of all adults and 33% of Black adult males. Having a felony conviction is worse for formerly incarcerated Black job applicants than white applicants. One study found that Black men with no criminal history applying for entry-level jobs were less likely to receive a callback than white male applicants who had recently been incarcerated. Research has shown that even in jurisdictions with ban the box policies barring employers from asking about a candidate's criminal history on job application, Black applicants receive significantly fewer callbacks than white job applicants because employers may assume the Black applicants have a criminal history. And we have that ban the box interjection, ban the box provision here in Sacramento, California. And I was, talking to this white worker, and I was like, oh, well, but they have to ban the box. So, and he was like, well, they check anyway. So anyway, while Black women have endured both racism and sexism, persistently have their labor devalued, Black men experience discrimination in the labor market in unique ways. This is in part due to the criminalization of Black men and boys examined in Chapter 11, which results in growing emphasis on soft skills, particularly disadvantages Black male job applicants, as many employers wrongly perceive Black men as lacking in these skills and are viewed as increasingly important. Researchers have found that employers hold false negative beliefs about the dependability, motivation, and attitude of Black men and are unlikely to change these racist beliefs during a written application or interview. Racial employment gaps are worse among educated workers. A 2014 study revealed that 12.4% of Black college graduates aged 22 to 27 were unemployed in 2013, compared to a rate of 5.6% for all college graduates in the same age range. 55.9% of the employed Black recent college graduates work in an occupation that typically does not require a 4-year college degree. Graduates in areas such as science, technology, math, and engineering fare far better, but still experienced high unemployment and underemployment rates. In 2013, Black recent college graduates majoring in 9 of the 12 broad categories had less than a 50% chance of holding a job that required their degree. Another study found that Black individuals who received MBAs from Harvard between 2007 and 2009 began their careers earning approximately $5,000 less than their white peers, and by 2015, the racial pay gap had increased to just under $100,000 annual. Had increased to just under 100,000 annually. Okay. All right. California. The historic gap in employment between Black and white individuals is seen in California. By every measure, Black Californians continue to lack access to labor markets available to white Californians, and as a result, continue to suffer harms that have compounded since before the founding of our country. In March 2022, for example, the most recent data available, the unemployment rate was 10.5% for Black Californians and 5.9% for white Californians. Lack of government protection. From the earliest days of statehood, California enacted a series of laws limiting the ability of African Americans to participate as full citizens of the state, as discussed in other chapters. These laws limited African Americans' voting rights, property rights, interracial marriage, and testimony in court or serve on a jury. California barred the testimony of Black individuals in both civil and criminal proceedings. These laws left Black Californians with little protection under the law, undermining their ability to advocate for themselves in the workplace, vindicate property rights, or even bear witness to the crimes they suffered. The discovery of gold in California, 1848, drew migrants from across the country and beyond. African Americans were among them. A small group of Black individuals established one of the earliest mining claims in Sacramento County at Negro Bar, near what is now Folsom, a property once owned by William Liedendorfs, an Afro-Caribbean businessman. African Americans operated several successful mines, including Horncut Mine, a prosperous quartz mine in Yuba County, and the Washington Mine, a gold mine established in 1869. Black miners faced a hostile environment. Because African Americans lacked the right to testify in court during this period, Black miners were vulnerable to legal challenges and encroachments on their mining claims. Frustrated by the discrimination they faced in California, including the state's discriminatory testimony and suffrage laws in particular, many Black miners left in the late 1850s for gold fields discovered in British Columbia. Though some returned to the United States after the Civil War, to this day, derogatory names like Negro Bar and Negro Flat are still used for locales in the mining region of California. The California Department of Parks and Recreation currently operates the Negro Bar Folsom Lake State Recreation Area. However, the department is working with local communities and stakeholders to change the name. Now, personally, interjection. I feel that erasing the name Negro Bar is erasing our history. I mean, that is what is on a lot of our birth certificates and our parents, grandparents' birth certificates. So I think it really should be preserved rather than erased. And they're right. In this book, in this report here, they did change the Negro Bar name, and now it is Black Miners Bar. And I just think that that's, making it flat blackness. But anyways, to change the name, all right. I don't see it as derogatory at all. We do need to remember these histories, even though they might be hard. Black mill workers played a significant role in the lumber industry from 1920 to 1960. Experienced Black workers were actively recruited from the South to staff California mills. Although vital to their employers, Black workers were paid less than their white counterparts and prohibited from undertaking supervisory roles. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, Black workers were recruited from the South to work farms in the San Joaquin and Imperial valleys. Many Black farm workers resisted the racist treatment they faced in California and used contracted field work as a way to establish themselves as entrepreneurs, skilled workers, or yeoman farmers. As a result, California farmers preferred to hire Mexican nationals and other non-white immigrants instead of Black workers. Additionally, growing towns and settlements during the time often explicitly discriminated against and worked to exclude African Americans from living or working there. For example, flyers for the Maywood Colony, a huge development entirely surrounding the town of Corning, California, trumpeted, "Good people." In most communities in California, you'll find Chinese, Japs, Dagos, Mexicans, and Negroes mixing up and working in competition with the white folks. Not so at Maywood Colony. Employment is not given to this element. In the early 1900s, Black workers were less likely to work in higher paying industrial jobs in the West than in the North. By 1930, over 50% of Black men were working in the industrial sectors of the Northeast and Midwest, but no more than 30% in the West. While industrial jobs often had significant downsides for Black voters, they offered better pay than unskilled positions. Still, many California companies refused to hire Black workers. For example, in 1940, aviation official W. Gerald Tuttle of the Bolte Aircraft Company in Southern California announced, "I regret to say that it is not the policy of this company to employ people other than the Caucasian race." The interwar period saw a significant influx of Black workers and residents to California. As the number of Black residents increased in cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles, Black workers not only increased in number, but also began to move into professions from which they had been previously been completely excluded. The New Deal in California. As it did across the country, the Great Depression brought significant unemployment to the state. For example, manufacturing employment fell by 30% from 1929 to its lowest level in 1932, while payrolls fell by 50% and employment among unionized workers rose to 33%, the New Deal provided an influx of funding to the state. For example, the Works Progress Administration employed over 100,000 workers in California. Between 1933 and 1939, the federal government sent $2.2 billion to California in the form of grants and loans. California governments engaged in discriminatory practices as the rest of the country did in dispersing this federal money. Burbank and Glendale invoked city ordinances to exclude a company of Black workers organized under the Civilian Conservation Corps. White residents of Richmond objected to an interracial Civilian Conservation Corps camp in 1935 until it was eventually replaced with an all-white company. Labor organizing has a long history in California that over time has led to some of the nation's most worker protective laws. The state first enacted its labor code in 1937, consolidating provisions then in existence. California has repeatedly amended its labor and employment laws since then. Like the government, however, California for decades exempted both agricultural and domestic workers from various protections. Assembly Bill 1066, signed into law in 2016, removed exemptions for agricultural employees that had been in place for hours, meal breaks, and other working conditions, including specified wage requirements. And it created phased-in overtime requirements for such workers. California enacted a Bill of Rights for domestic workers in 2013, extending overtime pay rights to some, but those workers remain without certain other protections. Wartime integration and exclusion from unions. Black workers made large advancements in the Bay Area during World War II, moving into manufacturing and industrial work in large numbers. By 1944, Black workers were employed widely in wartime industries, especially in the shipyards. For example, the city of Richmond saw a massive influx of war workers from 1940 to 1945, when its population grew from 24,000 to 100,000, with the Black population increasing from 270 to 14,000 in those years. The Federal Employment Practices Commission, the Federation, and discrimination agency active during World War II was largely ineffectual in California. In 1949, FEPC reported more than 26% of Negro working force were engaged in shipbuilding or ship repair. Another 25% were employed in servicing water transportation, which was largely government work. These two industries alone, the report concluded, accounted for approximately 12,000 Negro workers. Even so, the Bottlenmaker Union, representing ship workers, allowed only white workers to join the main branch of the union and relegated Black workers to an auxiliary union where they were not permitted to vote or file grievances, received limited benefits compared to white members, could not be promoted to foremen if the job involved supervising white workers, and were classified and paid as trainees even when qualified for skilled work. In Los Angeles, the International Longshoremen's and the Warehousemen's Union, Local 13, for example, excluded Black workers, even though Black workers and organizations sued the Boilermakers Union for discrimination. FEPC helped reveal racist hiring practices at Los Angeles airline manufacturing plants. Hearings in 1941 demonstrated that there were only 10 Black employees in Douglas Aircraft's workforce of 33,000. Only 2 among Bethlehem shipbuildings, nearly 3,000 Los Angeles employees, and only 54 among Lockheed Aircraft and Vega Airplanes, 48,000 workers. Black workers' organizations helped push this racist hiring to open more of the jobs for African Americans. Ultimately, FEPC never recommended the cancellation of any defense contracts in California during and after the war. Areas of California continued to experience job segregation. For example, Oakland's employment patterns continue to have Black men and women in separate lower skill and lower paid work when the end of the war brought layoffs. Black workers were disproportionately impacted. By the end of 1946, 1/3 of Black residents in the Bay Area and 40% of Black women were unemployed. Many African Americans also migrated to California during this period to pursue farming, though they encountered setbacks similar to those in other labor sectors. Approximately 30,000 to 40,000 African Americans traveled to the San Joaquin Valley after World War II. The majority settled in cities such as Fresno and Bakersfield, and about 7,000 settled in the Tulare Lake Basin, farmland owned by J.G. Boswell. Still, Black field workers faced discrimination. Unlike their white counterparts, they were rarely promoted to operate machinery for higher pay and were instead relegated to more demanding physical work for lower pay. Moreover, like in factories, Black workers also experienced greater injury and danger from farm work. Fair employment and housing and short-lived affirmative action. Several years before the federal government enacted its version of the law, California in 1959 passed the Fair Employment Practices Act, prohibiting employment discrimination on the basis of race by employers. The present-day version of the law is the California Fair Employment and Housing Act. The California Department of Fair Employment and Housing currently enforces the Fair EHA, which also prohibits harassment based on several different protected categories, including race. The state agency investigates, prosecutes, and mediates complaints of discrimination. Again, interjection, the DFEH. It's one of those agencies, they'll do an investigation, but like this report has said, discrimination is very hard to prove. It has to be directed specifically at you. So it's very, very rarely proven discrimination, that is. All right. California's support of the Department of Fair Employment and Housing has not been sufficient to meet the level of need. In 2013, the California Senate Office of Oversight and Outcomes reported that even though California had the strongest anti-discrimination law in the nation, the agency was funded with a relatively minuscule allotment of resources, which left the department unable to fully enforce the law and protect workers. The agency's investigations of employment discrimination claims suffered, and understaffing, poor quality intake, confusion, and premature case grading. The Oversight Office also unearthed a secret policy that had given the governor's office final say as to whether the discrimination law would be enforced against another California state agency, making it more difficult for government workers to bring a discrimination claim. In the years since this report issued, the department's budget has grown, but the number of complaints it receives each year has also risen. Like the federal government agencies in California also implemented affirmative action programs in employment. These programs produce mixed results. For example, between 1977 and 1995, the representation of Black tenured faculty members at the University of California system, which implemented affirmative action in its hiring, grew from 1.8% to only 2.5%. And the community colleges faculty between 1984 and 1991. The proportion of Black faculty only grew from 4.9% to 5.7%. California's affirmative action programs were banned in 1996 after voters passed Proposition 209. Proposition 209 amended the California Constitution to prohibit state institutions from considering race in hiring, contracting, and education. According to polling data, Proposition 209 was supported by a majority of white and male voters, but opposed by a majority of African American, Latino, Asian American, and female voters. The evidence regarding Proposition 209 impact on employment opportunities is complex. In the 15-year period that followed Proposition 209 going into effect, the representation of African Americans, Latino, and women in public sectors relative to that in private sector did not dramatically increase or decrease. Men and women of color working for the state of California continued to earn less than their white, non-Hispanic male counterparts and remained underrepresented in high-level positions. Proposition 209's impact on the procurement process was more severe, as state and local governments were forced to abandon race-conscious contracting programs. Prior to the Proposition 209 passage, awards of public contracts to businesses owned by people of color and women had been rising, reaching a high of 28% in 1994. By 1998, awards had fallen to less than 10%, and they never recovered despite the increasing diversity in California. All right, I'm just going to stop it right here 1 second real quick. Get a drink of water for one. But for two, wondering how 209 even made it to the ballot. I mean, so did the California Congress approve this and push this through to the ballot? Because that's, our leaders and legislators were letting us down then. Or I think another way it can get to the ballot is if it gets a certain amount of signatures or some kind of a petition. So I'll have to check into that to see if, our California legislators actually push that through, unlike ACA 3 to end involuntary servitude and slavery in prison, which they did not pushed through to the ballot. All right, let's continue. One study published in 2006 found that only 32% of certified minority business enterprises in California 1996 transportation construction industry were still in business after 10 years later. And among those that had survived, businesses owned by African Americans had fared less well than others. Another study published in 2015 found that Proposition 209 had led to a loss of between $1 billion and $1.1 billion annually for businesses owned by people of color or women. As Black entrepreneurs are more likely than their white counterparts to hire Black job applicants, the closing of the Black businesses may have also hurt Black employment. Activists in California have worked to overturn Proposition 209, but have not been successful. In 2020, voters rejected Proposition 16, which would have repealed Proposition 209. Occupational licensure in California. Nearly 21% of workers in California must obtain a license to work in their jobs. California required workers to obtain a license for 61% of lower income occupations, ranking it the third most restrictive state nationwide, following only Louisiana and Arizona. California withholds or restricts access to licenses from persons with certain criminal convictions, which is more likely to harm Black residents. For example, as discussed in Chapter 11, some incarcerated Californians participate in a program to help battle wildfires. Upon release, however, the program participants would not be eligible for jobs in many fire departments because they cannot obtain an emergency medical technician EMT certification. California law specifically prohibits EMT certification for anyone who has been incarcerated for a felony within the past 10 years, effectively disqualifying many people who participated in fire camp. In 2020, recent attempts to remediate these issues related to firefighting have had limited success. California has made some strides in lifting restrictions on occupational licensure in recent years with the passage of AB 2138, which prohibits California licensing boards from denying a license for, among other things, many convictions older than 7 years and dismissed or expunged convictions. While AB 2138 represents progress, other schemes remain in California which continue to have racially discriminating impacts. Ooh, let me get another quick sip of water. Okay. Continue to have racially discriminatory impact. Discrimination in government employment. In addition to supporting legal segregation and enabling private discrimination, the federal and California governments discriminated against Black workers as employers. The federal government in civil and military service has refused to employ Black workers, segregated and integrated workforce, and relegated Black workers to lower paid, less skilled occupations. The state and local governments in California have had similar patterns of discrimination. Segregation in federal civilian service. The federal civilian service reflected and shaped the racist labor environment of private employers. For much of the federal government's history, it was almost totally white or segregated. During the 19th century, there was no blanket ban on Black workers, but different officials were allowed to create a patchwork of regulations forbidding employment of African Americans. The United States Postal Service was a striking example. In 1802, Black workers were banned from carrying mail. Black workers were almost completely excluded from completely excluded or from federal employment until 1861. The year a Black man was appointed as a clerk with the United States Postal Office in Boston. 1861. Okay. At the turn of the century, African Americans made up about 10% of federal workforce. Many Black workers found steady, valuable jobs in the United urban post offices, but there was little possibility of advancement. President Roosevelt provided some support for threatened Black workers. In 1903, he refused to allow the town of Indianola, Mississippi, to drive out its Black postmaster, instead suspending service at the Indianola post office rather than accept the resignation of Postmaster Minnie Cox. But this lasted only until the next year when a white postmaster was appointed, and the tide turned with the election of President William Howard Taft in 1908, who stated in his inaugural address, "It is not the disposition or within the province of the federal government to interfere with the regulation by southern states of their domestic affairs, and that appointing African Americans to federal offices in prejudiced southern communities would do more harm than good." So for our own good, they excluded us from these opportunities. That was the interjection. In 1913, President Wilson officially segregated much of the federal workforce, including the Treasury, the Post Office, the Bureau of Engraving and Prints, the Navy, the Interior, the Marine Hospital, the War Department, and the Government Printing Office. The federal government created separate offices, lunchrooms, and bathrooms for white and Black workers. William McAdoo, Secretary of the Treasury, argued that segregation was necessary to remove the causes of complaint and irritation where white women have been forced unnecessarily to sit at desks with colored men. The federal government fired Black supervisors and cut off Black employees' access to promotions and better paying jobs, and it reserved those jobs for white employees. Postmaster General Albert S. Burleston segregated, demoted, or fired Black workers, though no official government record has been found that indicate how many Black postal workers were driven from their jobs. There was a clear pattern to segregate, reclassify, and discharge Black workers. President Wilson's decision to segregate and integrate federal workforce resulted in lower pay jobs for Black workers, cut off from better paying jobs. and created separate toilets in the Treasury and Interior departments. This damaged the ability of African Americans to build economic security. For example, in Washington, D.C., home of many federal jobs, Black home ownership fell after President Wilson's actions, in part because Black federal employees no longer had access to those better jobs and salaries. In 1979, the U.S. General Accounting Office found that exams administered by the Office of Personnel Management to screen applicants for federal jobs disqualified Black candidates at higher rates than white candidates, offering no real opportunity for Black job seekers to be fairly assessed for the federal job. Few Black applicants received scores high enough to have a realistic chance of being considered for employment. The later study commissioned by the U.S. Office of Personnel Management examined the cases of all 11,920 federal workers fired in 1992, excluding the Postal Service and uniformed military services, and found that 39% of those fired were Black, even though Black workers comprised only 17% of the workforce at the time. That math isn't really mathing. 17%, but 39% fired? Wow. All right. While federal personnel officials believe that Black employees were fired more often because they tended to be less experienced, less educated, and concentrated in lower level jobs that experienced more turnover, the study found that after every measurable factor was discounted, Black workers were still more likely to be fired at nearly every pay grade, from the lower rungs to the senior executive level. Despite the federal government's history of racism against Black workers currently make up more of the federal civil service at over 18% and the general population at 14%. However, for the senior executive service, the elite corps of experienced civil servants responsible for leading the federal workforce, only 10% are Black. Segregation in military service. The military reflected the rest of the federal government and American society in enacting racist and segregationist policies for much of its history. While African Americans have consistently served in the military since the very beginning of this country, the military has historically paid Black soldiers less than white soldiers and often deemed African Americans unfit for service until the military needed them to fight. The military officially remained segregated until 1950. Black soldiers consistently failed to be recognized for their contribution, and the government failed to follow through on promises of greater opportunities in exchange for service. While military service has provided an avenue for African Americans to achieve a measure of economic stability, it has consistently been a place of racial discrimination and segregation, particularly in the highest ranks. Today, there continues to be a limited number of African Americans in leadership roles. The Revolution and the War of 1812. African Americans' military service predates the Republic itself, as do the government's actions discriminating against Black soldiers and failing to honor promises in exchange for their service. Both free and enslaved Black soldiers from all 13 colonies fought with the Continental Army and state militias in the American Revolution. During the American siege of Yorktown in 1781, British troops, in order to extend dwindling food supplies, expelled all black volunteer soldiers they had recruited with promises of freedom. One British officer admitted the betrayal, stating, "We had used them to good advantage and set them free, and now, with fear and trembling, they had to face the reward of their cruel masters." While Joseph Ranger, a free black man from Virginia, served in the Navy of Virginia and received wages, a land grant, and later a life pension from the U.S. government, David Baker, an enslaved man on the Isle of Wight, was forced to join the American Navy as a substitute for his enslaver and was re-enslaved after the war. Wow, he had to fight in place of his enslaver, and then he was re-enslaved. Wild. After the Republic was established, the Second U.S. Congress passed the Militia Law of 1792, allowing only free, able-bodied white male citizens to serve in the National Militia, which became the National Guard. In 1796, James McHenry, the Secretary of War, declared no Negro, mulatto, or Indian is to be recruited in the Marine Corps. The U.S. Marine Corps continued this ban of African Americans for the next 167 years. During the War of 1812, regardless of the fact that black soldiers were legally not allowed to serve, black soldiers made up a significant portion of U.S. Navy forces, and approximately 1/4 of the U.S. soldiers at the Battle of Lake Erie were black. While many volunteer black soldiers were explicitly promised freedom or equal opportunities in the future in exchange for their service by the state or federal government, these promises never fully materialized. Like they had done during the Revolutionary War, British troops recruited black soldiers by promising freedom and land in exchange for their service, but they largely failed to deliver. In fact, Francis Scott Key's The Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem, contains a little-known but controversial verse understood by some scholars to have been intended as a threat or admonition to black soldiers. Admonition to black soldiers. Might have escaped slavery and joined the British because in a bid for freedom. And wait, did I miss something here? Let's see. Admonition. Never material. Okay. Yeah, admonition to black soldiers who might have escaped slavery and joined the British because in a bid for freedom and the means for self-support. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or gloom of the grave. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Oh, yeah. Okay, the home of the brave. Right. The Civil War. In the time of the Civil War, African Americans again attempted to join the war effort, notwithstanding the Army's racist treatment and failures to follow through on promises. In 1862, Congress amended the law to permit African Americans to enlist in the Union Army, but initially only in menial construction and camp service roles. Black women labored in refugee camps as servants for Union officers and as laundresses for Union troops. African Americans were finally admitted to military service in the Union following the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Eventually, nearly 200,000 Black soldiers, roughly half of whom were formerly enslaved Southerners, served in the Union Army. Once again, Black soldiers were afforded lesser treatment in their military service. Black soldiers were segregated, assigned lowly positions, had few opportunities for advancement to officer rank, received lower pay, and faced far more severe disciplinary measures. Second Lieutenant R.H. Isabel, the target during a purge of Black officers, resigned in disillusionment in 1863, stating that he joined the United States Army with the sole object of laboring for the good of the Union, supposing that all past prejudice would be suspended for the good of our country, and that all native-born Americans would unite together to sacrifice their blood for the cause as their fathers did in 1812 and 15, but he found that the same prejudice still exists. During the Civil War, Black soldiers took home net pay of $7 per month compared to $13 per month for white soldiers, and Black soldiers faced a higher mortality rate than their white counterparts, largely due to racist differences in medical care on the battlefield. One soldier lamented, "We are said to be U.S. soldiers, and behold, we are U.S. slaves." In fact, a small number of Black soldiers did not serve willingly in the Civil War. Starting in 1863, some Union officials used tactics similar to enslavers, press gangs, and man-stealers to grow the ranks of the Union Army. One Army engineer in 1863 stated that of free men forced into service, my men, colonel, have not been drafted. They have been kidnapped in the night. Despite President Lincoln declaring in 1865 that without the military help of the Black freedmen, the war against the South could not have been won. Okay, let's hear that one more time. Despite President Lincoln declaring in 1865 that without the military help of the Black freedmen, the war against the South could not have been won. Black soldiers were not treated on equal footing and suffered economic and social hardship as a direct result of the government's actions during the war. World War I and II. Following the Civil War, Black soldiers in the 9th and 10th Cavalries and the 24th and 25th Infantries became known as the Buffalo Soldiers. With few exceptions, West Point graduates Henry O. Flipper, John Hanks, Alexander, and Charles Young, these all-Black regiments were led by white U.S. Army officials. Buffalo Soldiers aided in the nation's westward expansion by building roads and participating in military actions that included the Red River War, 1874, 1875, and the Battle of San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War, 1898. These men were also some of the first National Park Rangers. However, the legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers is complex. These black soldiers fought for their rightful citizenship rights by fighting for a white-led government in wars to take to the Southwest and Great Plains from Native Americans. Between 1870 and 1890, 18 black Buffalo soldiers earned medals of honor while fighting Native Americans. Despite their service, Buffalo soldiers faced discrimination. Some were able to access higher education, secure better jobs, and own property, but others returned from service only to be lynched. While opportunity expanded in the military during the period after the Civil War and more African Americans joined the service, black soldiers continued to serve in the armed forces under segregated and unequal conditions. But increased military needs prevailed, and by World War I, there were 380,000 black soldiers out of the 4 million total soldiers, a proportion similar to that of black men in the general population. During World War I, black men volunteered to serve in 8 all-black Army regiments, but remained strictly segregated from white soldiers. Black soldiers were subject to humiliations, including wearing discarded Civil War uniforms or performing for the amusement of white soldiers. One black soldier at the time lamented that the spirit of the Saint Nazaire Army station in France is the spirit of the South. This played out in the numbers. Only 11% of black soldiers saw combat in World War I, while the vast majority were relegated to menial labor. This segregation reflected the larger condition of the American economy, and the black soldiers were prevented from moving up in the ranks to supervisory positions, and positions in some specialized corps were blocked altogether. This pattern continued in the interwar years and in World War II, when African Americans continued to serve in the military service despite segregation and other racist policies. For example, in 1941, the U.S. Army established the 78th Tank Battalion, the first black armor unit. It was made up of black enlisted men and white officers, but without opportunity for the black soldiers to advance. Author James Baldwin remarked that the treatment accorded the Negro during the Second World War marked a turning point in the Negro's relation to America. A certain hope died. This pattern extended to the congressional actions aimed at helping soldiers returning from fighting in World War II. In 1944, the Congress passed a Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, commonly known as the GI Bill. The GI Bill included provisions to provide financial assistance for home ownership, opening small businesses, and education. But like the New Deal legislation before it, it left implementation largely to the racist state and local government and contributed to housing discrimination. As a result, its benefits were not fully realized for returning black soldiers. For a discussion of the role of the Veterans Administration in implementing and maintaining housing segregation, see Chapter 5. For a discussion on the VA's role in education discrimination, see Chapter 6. Post-World War II to present. In 1941, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802 stating, "I do hereby reaffirm the policy of the United States that there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin." And if you'll remember, in a quick interjection, if you'll remember earlier, in this section, we read that he enacted that executive order because he did not want a march on March on Washington. That's the only reason he did that. The Marine Corps received its first Black recruits, but continued to segregate. Even though we were all Marines, we were kept separate. We didn't have barracks. We lived in huts built from cardboard, painted green, Camp Lejeune and barracks, but we had huts. It was located in the backwoods amid water snakes and bears. And Marine sergeants, said Marine Sergeant Carol Revis. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman issued Executive Order 9981 to desegregate the military. But while the military formally integrated, serious racial discrimination persisted. For example, the Army did not begin in earnest to integrate its forces until the Korean War, when demand for additional troops meant that the Army had no choice but to send Black troops to replace white troops killed or injured in battle. Segregated all-Black Army units persisted until 1954, and the Marines' full integration did not occur until 1960. Despite discrimination by the federal government, Black soldiers served and died for their country and have historically used it as a mode of upward mobility out of the South. The highest proportion of Black individuals ever to serve in an American war came in the Vietnam War. Young Black men were disproportionately drafted during the Vietnam War years due to education and occupation deferments that were unavailable to Black men due to a century of education segregation and discrimination. In the Vietnam War, the American military no longer believed that Black men were not fit for combat. Black men had a much greater chance of being on the front line and suffering a much higher casualty rate. In 1965 alone, Black soldiers were almost 25% of those killed in action. As the United States moved to an all-volunteer military following the Vietnam War and the end of conscription, Black soldiers enlisted at a much higher rate than white individuals, leading Black representation in the military to be roughly twice their representation in the U.S. population at large. Today, racial disparities in the military continue, even as lower level troops were integrated. Leadership remained almost exclusively white. As late as 2020, of the 41 officials holding 4-star rank, only 2 were African Americans. Based on government data received through the Freedom of Information Act, researchers have found evidence that Black service members have been substantially more likely than white service members to face military justice or disciplinary action. Anecdotal news reports have presented a deep-rooted culture of racism and discrimination in all branches of the armed services. On January 6, 2021, insurgents stormed the U.S. Capitol, carried a Confederate flag inside the Capitol building, and displayed a noose and gallows in front of it. Of the more than 700 individuals charged in the January 6 insurrection, 81 people have ties to the military. California. Although African Americans were present in California going back to the Spanish conquest era, they made up only around 1% or less of the population of California until 1920, and under 2% until the 1940s. Still, the pattern seen in the federal civilian service and military service persisted in California at both the state and local levels. Black workers faced segregation and racial discrimination in state and local employment. Even when progress was made, governments failed to meaningfully address past discrimination, and Black workers remained largely shut out of higher paid leadership roles, a trend that still exists in the present. Up until World War II, Black workers were absent from many public and private sector jobs in San Francisco. For example, no Black worker was employed as a public school teacher, police officer, firefighter, or streetcar conductor, nor as a bank teller or bus or cab driver in the city before 1940. There were no Black streetcar workers until 1942, with poet Maya Angelou being one of the first, though this was not due to lack of available skilled workforce in the area, as evidenced by the fact that within 2 years there were over 700 Black platform operators. When Bay Area Rapid Transit BART system was built in 1967, no skilled Black workers were hired. The National Labor Relations Board certified unions did not admit Black members, and BART, through the government agency, refused to use its power to insist on non-discriminatory discrimination policies by the unions. And it was a similar story when Oakland built a new central post office during the same period. Not a single Black plumber, operating engineer, sheet metal worker, iron worker, electrician, or stream filter was hired. A steam fitter was hired for construction on the federally funded government building. The city of Pasadena in Southern California similarly employed almost no African Americans in government jobs prior to World War II. In Pasadena, they told me they don't hire Black teachers, said Ruby McKnight Williams, the first Black woman to be employed by the city in a professional capacity in 1940. When Miss Williams was hired, I found out that no Black men were employed by the city except garbage men and 2 or 3 men who swept City Hall. As for Black women, even the attendants in the restrooms at the Rose Bowl had never been colored. Other types of government actions enforce racist and segregationist policies on Black Californians in different parts of the state. For example, in 1970, Pasadena became the first city outside of the South under the federal court order to desegregate its schools in 1970. In its ruling on the matter, the district court concluded that the Pasadena School District had discriminated both in its placement of students and in its allocation of teachers. As the court observed, the district's failures to comply with its own integration policies had occurred in connection with the teacher assignment, hiring, and promotion policies and practices at the district, its construction policies and practices, and its assignment of students. Some segments of the public sector, like law enforcement and firefighting, continue to discriminate against Black Californians. When they hired Black Californians, hostile work environments sometimes followed. The San Francisco Fire Department, for example, had no Black firefighters before 1955, and by 1970, when Black residents made up 14% of the city's population, only 4 of the department's 1,800 uniformed firefighters were Black. Public sector employers have provided significant opportunities for Black workers as compared to their private sector counterparts, including in California. Even still, Black workers continue to encounter barriers to career advancement and higher pay. As of 2018, Black workers account for 9.8% of California's state civil service compared to 5.3% of the state's labor force and 5.5% of the population. However, that 9.8% share has been disproportionately concentrated in lower salary ranges. Black civil servants represented 12.6% of employees earning $40,000 or less, but only 5.7% of workers earning more than $130,000. Let's read that part one more time. Black civil servants represented 12.6% of employees earning $40,000 or less, but only 5.7% of workers earning more than $130,000. Effects today. The cumulative impacts of the federal, state, and local governments' racial discrimination and segregation continue to harm African Americans today. In 2019, the median Black household earned 61 cents for every dollar earned by the median white household. This is a slight increase from 2016 when Black households earned 56 cents to the dollar, a figure lower than it had been in 1968 after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. As a result of higher unemployment rate and the persistent wage gap, African Americans experience higher level of poverty. In 2020, 19.8% of African Americans were living in poverty compared to 8.3% of white Americans. Due to a combination of racism and sexism, women have always had a higher rate of poverty than men. 12% of white women are impoverished compared to 23% of Black women. Black families are more likely than white families to have family members who are impoverished. This is a destabilizing effect during periods of emergencies. A 2020 study found that 36% of white families had enough savings to cover 6 months of expenses versus 14% of Black families. Another recent survey also found that 36% of Black respondents said that they had no money at all to set aside for emergencies, compared to 24% of white respondents without a safety net. A safety net of savings. African Americans can be more vulnerable to upheavals in the labor market and are more likely to experience homelessness, as discussed in Chapter 5. During the COVID-19 pandemic, African Americans were more likely to hold jobs that exposed them to the novel coronavirus and more likely to lose their jobs at the same time. They were more likely to see their savings shrink and more likely to not have enough to eat. As was the case after the 2008 recession, they are experiencing the slowest recovery. While African Americans have made significant advances into occupations and job categories that used to be subject to explicit segregation or kept Black workers at the margins, there has been a limit to this progress. In 2021, an analysis of the 50 most valuable public companies demonstrated that only 8% of C-suite executives and the highest corporate leaders, usually those that report to the chief executive officer, are Black. At least 8 companies list no Black executives among their leadership team as of December 2021. Moreover, much of the gains that African Americans have made in employment and wages have been offset by the intensifying income inequality in the country as a whole. California. The numbers are similar for California. In 2019, the Public Policy Institute of California reported that about 17.4% of Black Californians were poor or near poor compared to 12.1% of white people. In 2020, the poverty rate was 14.6% among Black Californians and 7.9% among white residents. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, Black families in California were nearly twice as likely to be in the bottom tier of income distribution than would be expected for their share of the population, factors that led to African Americans often being first to suffer economic downturn and last to recover also persist in California. During the COVID-19 pandemic, 68% of the surveyed Black workers in Southern California who had lost their jobs reported that they were still looking for work a year after the start of the pandemic. African Americans are also underrepresented in California's 2 major industries, Hollywood and Silicon Valley. In Hollywood, for example, in films released between 2015 and 2019, Black actors were less likely to be in lead roles than white actors, and Black actors were often funneled into race-related projects which are typically less well-funded. Emerging Black actors receive 6 leading role opportunities early in their careers compared with 9 for white actors. Black talent is even more underrepresented in positions of creative control. African American directors directed 6% of films released between 2015 and 2019. African American producers produced 6% of those films, and African American screenwriters 4% of those films. In 2020, the Los Angeles Times conducted a study on diversity in Hollywood studios and reported that of 230 senior corporate executives, division heads, and other senior leaders in entertainment companies, analyzed by the time, 10% were African American, 92% of film industry C-suite executives were white, making the industry more homogeneous than the energy and finance industries. Conclusion. Enslavement was the nation's original disregard for Black lives and theft of Black labor. Slavery persisted for more than 200 years, and when it formally ended, the nation found new ways, from Black codes to Jim Crow, to keep Black Americans tethered to the lowest rungs of work. Discrimination, exclusion, and devaluation never ceased. For more than 150 years since the formal end of slavery, African Americans have been denied opportunity and pathways to higher wages and been shunned into the lowest paying, least protected, and oft times most dangerous work, or they have been denied work altogether. The disparities are worse in Silicon Valley, although between 2004 and 2014, Black college students were more likely to major in computer science than white students. In 2018, a 2018 report revealed that a large tech firm in Silicon Valley, African Americans made up only 4.4% of all employees, 1.4% were executives, 2.5% were managers, and 2.9% were professionals. A recent report also found that for every Black individual who is directly employee of tech companies, there are 1.4 Black contract workers who generally earn 75 cents for every dollar they made between direct employee and less health benefits. Okay. All right. Let's see. Been all together. Okay. All right. I might have read that in reverse, but y'all get the idea. I mean, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So let's wrap this up. The few instances of affirmative effort to remedy or at least neutralize discrimination were inadequate and short-lived. Severe employment and wage disparities and attendant socioeconomic gaps never closed because the root causes of discrimination, exclusion, and subjugation were never addressed and have been sanctioned by the government and allowed to persist and entrench. Centuries of government-supported and government-protected racism have produced a labor market that is solidly and structurally anti-Black, that it can now stand on its own. It cannot and will not come undone without an affirmative dismantling and concentrated investment in creating opportunity for full participation by African Americans and full valuation of their work. Amen. And that brings us to the end notes here on Chapter 10, Stolen Labor and Hindered Opportunity. You know, I really felt that chapter in my soul. I know a lot of us have gone through it. I mean, for everything with dealing with the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, that agency that we discussed here. And like I said, they're just basically a mediation agency. Like they said, they're underfunded, understaffed, and they really can't find any discrimination because discrimination is hard to prove in California. So, I mean, if anybody knows any good civil rights lawyers out there, send them my way to etmmedia.group@gmail.com. Just hit me up because, you know how it is. And it was described in this chapter. So, we will be returning tomorrow with Chapter 11. Moya will be picking that back up to get through the end on this. Chapter 13, I think, is the last one. So, yeah, thanks for joining tonight, fam. And peace, love, and reparations.
The way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have Black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
You know, Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total Black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.